If you've been following the news about coronavirus, you've probably come across the term herd immunity. Herd immunity refers to a population in which a sufficient number of people are immune to the virus to protect those who aren't. The traditional concept of herd immunity is usually illustrated with figures like this, which show a population naive to a virus about to be infected. Once about 80% of the people become immune to the virus, either through vaccination or being infected and recovering, then those who aren't immune are protected by being surrounded by those who are. In recent months, a growing number of scientists have proposed that herd immunity can be achieved at much lower levels of population infection. These scientists have come under withering attack in the mainstream media and from many government figures. Here's a good example of one such attack, which appeared on CNN. The article quotes a Dr. Liana Wen, who states that 2 million Americans will have to die before herd immunity is achieved. She's assuming that up to 80% of people will have to get infected before herd immunity kicks in, and 1% of those will die from coronavirus. These are, without a doubt, scary numbers. But let's take a closer look at the assumptions which underlie these numbers. The first assumption, Dr. Wen clearly states, that the fatality rate, or IFR, of COVID is around 1%. The second assumption is assumed by all traditional models of herd immunity, but is unstated. That is, all people are equally susceptible to this virus. The third assumption is also unstated. It's that all people are homogeneous in terms of connectivity, which means they have equal numbers of social connections and chances to contract the virus. Surprisingly, several articles have appeared in major and well-respected international medical and scientific journals which explicitly contradict these three assumptions. Let's look at these assumptions one by one. Number one, the IFR of COVID is around 1%. In September, the World Health Organization published a study by John Ioannidis, a researcher at Stanford University, who studied the IFR numbers for 51 locations around the world, and he concluded that the median IFR for COVID was 0.27%. Thus, instead of 1% or 1 in 100 people dying from this disease, fewer than 3 in 1,000 people die from COVID. You'll find higher and lower numbers in the scientific literature, but they'll only differ from the WHO figure by a few tenths of 1%, meaning that COVID is far less deadly than it is portrayed in the media. Number two, all people are equally susceptible to the virus. Also in September, Peter Doshi, an associate editor at BMJ, the British medical journal, one of the world's leading medical journals, published an article in which he discussed 6 scientific reports on people who have pre-existing immunity to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. Doshi reported that between 20 and 50% of people studied had T-cell reactivity to SARS-CoV-2, despite no known exposure to the virus. All the way back in April, Cell, one of the world's leading biology journals, published a report on pre-existing immunity to SARS-CoV-2. The authors of that study found T-cell reactivity to SARS-CoV-2 in 40 to 60% of the unexposed individuals they studied. They speculated that this pre-existing immunity came from previous exposure to other coronaviruses, such as those which cause the common cold. Dr. Doshi, author of the first study I mentioned, says that these studies are going to force us to reconsider basic assumptions about population susceptibility and pandemic planning. Now, these are scientific papers on pre-existing immunity, but do we have any real-world examples of pre-existing immunity to the virus? Well, it turns out we do. In February of this year, almost 4,000 people spent 4 weeks locked on board the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which was moored off of Yokohama, Japan. On February 17th, Dr. Kentaro Iwata visited the ship and reported that conditions were completely chaotic. He observed that almost no protection measures were being taken. The virus was allowed to pass from room to room through the ventilation system, Essentially, the passengers spent 4 weeks marinating in a broth of coronavirus. And despite most of the passengers being elderly, as is typical on cruise ships, how many do you think contracted the coronavirus? It turns out that out of 3,711 passengers and crew, only just over 700 became infected with coronavirus. That's slightly under 19%, and that's under ideal conditions for coronavirus transmission. The only explanation for this is that a significant number of passengers had some form of pre-existing immunity to coronavirus. This brings us to the third assumption underlying traditional models of herd immunity, namely that people are homogeneous in terms of connectivity. In August, Tom Britton, a researcher at Stockholm University, published a paper in Science magazine in which he used mathematical models to show how heterogeneities in human populations will result in herd immunity thresholds far below those assumed by traditional models of herd immunity. Dr. Britton noted that no realistic model of herd immunity can assume that human populations are homogeneous. In April, Gabriela Gomez, a researcher and mathematician at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, published a fascinating paper on herd immunity thresholds. She introduced the concept of connectivity. Connectivity refers to how many social connections a person has. She noted that some people have many social connections, whereas others have very few, if any. She observed that the virus first infects those individuals who have a high degree of connectivity. These individuals tend to be infected very early in the course of a pandemic. From the perspective of the virus, these individuals are the low-hanging fruit. Once these individuals are infected, it becomes much more difficult for the virus to infect other individuals who are more distant or less connected. Dr. Gomez observes that as the susceptible subpopulation declines, the rate at which the virus spreads declines significantly. Eventually, the susceptible population declines to the point at which the virus can no longer spread in an epidemic way. In other words, herd immunity is reached. Writing all the way back in April, Dr. Gomez concluded that some populations may already be close to achieving herd immunity, regardless of the strictness of their social distancing measures. So now, let's put this all together and see how this changes our model of herd immunity. First, let's explicitly state our assumptions. Number one, around 50% of people already have pre-existing immunity. Number two, populations are heterogeneous in terms of connectivity or social connections. And number three, once the most connected people become immune, the epidemic quickly fades. Based on this, what can we conclude? First, herd immunity kicks in at a much lower level of infection than previously believed. And second, lockdowns actually prevent the natural protective process of herd immunity. How can we represent this new model in a figure? Well, it would look something like this. Rather than a homogeneous group of people, equally spaced, we could spread the people out across the figure using space to indicate differences in connectivity, with a group of people at the center of the figure representing those who are most socially connected, and smaller groups at the edges of the figure representing those who are less well connected. Obviously, this is how society is really arranged, with young people, university students, and workers at the center of society with many social connections, and other groups and individuals scattered at varying degrees of distance from that central core. Naturally, those in that central core would be most susceptible to any virus. Now, knowing what we know about pre-existing immunity to SARS-CoV-2, we would have to make about half of these people immune to the virus. What Dr. Gomez speculates is that the central core of highly connected people quickly become infected in a pandemic, and thereafter the virus finds it very difficult to spread to those who are less well connected. Of course, it's interesting to look at scientific papers and create models and even images to represent those models, but do these models bear any relation to the real world? Well, let's look at a country where a severe lockdown appears to have prevented spread before herd immunity could be achieved. Portugal is one such country. Look at the massive spike in deaths as we enter the fall. I'm using deaths rather than cases because massive increases in the numbers of tests performed makes it difficult to make accurate comparisons between the late days of the pandemic and the early days. Now, let's look at a place where the virus was allowed to spread very rapidly before lockdown measures were introduced. New York is one such place. Given the 2-week lag time between infection and death in cases of COVID mortality, it's quite clear that the virus had already spread rapidly through the most susceptible populations in New York before social distancing measures were introduced in late March. Notice the distinct lack of a peak in deaths as we get into the fall. Why is this? I think the answer is clear. New York achieved effective herd immunity in the spring. Of course, when the topic of herd immunity comes up, many people want to discuss Sweden, but I think there's another country that is much more interesting to look at. That country is Japan, where I have many contacts, especially in the medical community, through my work. Japan received 925,000 visitors from mainland China in January of this year. I happened to be in Japan in January, and I saw crowds of happy mainland Chinese visitors wherever I went. Given that SARS-CoV-2 originated in mainland China in December of 2019, it's clear that it had certainly been carried to Japan by January of this year and was allowed to spread widely through the country during the spring. The interesting thing is that Japan had no lockdown of any kind. On November 10th of this year, the Washington Post ran an article comparing various lockdown measures in several cities around the world. Here's their page for Rome, which is typical of many European cities and American states. Notice all the things that are closed. Now, here's Tokyo. Nothing is closed. In fact, you can eat in restaurants, you can go to movie theaters, you can go to bars, you can have social gatherings. Essentially, you can do whatever you want. And it has been this way since the beginning of the pandemic. True, the Japanese have a deeply ingrained mask-wearing culture, and they wear masks to prevent hay fever and to prevent passing germs to other people when they're sick. So of course they've been masking up during this pandemic. But when they dine in restaurants, and often while at work, they will remove their masks, and they're not really social distancing in those places. Here's a picture of an izakaya, a Japanese pub-style restaurant from that very same Washington Post article. The picture was taken in July, which is when Japan was experiencing something of a surge in cases. Notice how none of the patrons in the restaurant are wearing masks, and the restaurant is tightly packed. I've been checking in with contacts in Japan regularly since the start of the pandemic, and they tell me that this is absolutely normal all across Japan. So what is my point? I believe that Japan, and particularly Tokyo, has already achieved effective herd immunity. Here is a graph of daily coronavirus deaths produced by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government. Those are single-digit and double-digit numbers on the vertical axis. Months are indicated by numbers at the bottom of the graph. Like almost everywhere else, there was a peak of coronavirus deaths in the spring, with a high of 12 in April. Then all the way over to the right side of the graph, in November, you'll notice that deaths are down to 1 or 2 a day, and many days, nobody dies from COVID-19. To me, this indicates that the city of Tokyo already has achieved herd immunity. And it's not just me thinking this. Japanese scientists have come to the same conclusion. In September, a team of Japanese scientists published a paper in which they reported the results of a wide-scale seroprevalence study. They took blood samples from almost 2,000 office workers working at a large Tokyo company during Japan's second wave in June and July of this year. They reported that the seroprevalence of SARS-CoV-2 rose from around 5% to 46% over the course of their study. Shortly after this peak in seroprevalence rates, the reported daily cases started to decline dramatically. It's worth quoting verbatim the conclusion they reached. Given the temporal correlation between the rise in seropositivity and the decrease in reported COVID-19 cases that occurred without a shutdown, herd immunity may be implicated. It seems that, one way or another, the Japanese response to the coronavirus has actually been the correct one. Essentially, they let the virus run pretty much freely throughout their society while protecting, as much as possible, old folks' homes, hospitals, and the vulnerable. And in doing so, they've achieved a death rate of 15 per million for COVID-19. In contrast, in the United States, the death rate is 777 per million. Of course, on average, the Japanese are much fitter than Americans, but it's also worth pointing out that Japan has the highest percentage of elderly citizens of any country on earth, and fully 1/3 of people in Japan are over 60 years of age. And so, without destroying their economy with crushing lockdowns, the Japanese have achieved a death rate that is the envy of the developed world. In places like New York City, where the virus hit before any reasonable measures could be taken to prevent its spread, there was an appalling toll among the elderly in care homes and in hospitals. But now, we know so much more about this virus, and we know that among the young and the middle-aged and the healthy, there's a negligible risk of dying from this virus. Unfortunately, as we head into the winter, case counts appear to be increasing, and many places are considering or have already imposed severe lockdowns. I believe that this is a mistake. Rather, what we should do is allow the young and the healthy and the most social among us to continue their lives as they lived them before the start of this year. They may contract the virus, they may not. They will almost certainly survive it if they do. And in doing so, they will actually protect those members of society who are most vulnerable. Because when the most connected members of society become immune by contracting and getting over the virus, it makes it much more difficult for the virus to spread to other parts of society. Indeed, in this way, the most connected members of society, who stand the least chance of dying from the disease, actually form a kind of protective barrier around the most vulnerable. Although perhaps barrier around is misleading, rather, they block the channels by which the virus can travel to the less well-connected members of society. In short, when they are uninfected, they are the channel by which the virus will reach those people. When they're infected and recovered, they prevent the virus from traveling along those channels. They can either protect or they can endanger. And it is government policy that decides which role they will play. Think about it. Our countries are spending trillions of dollars to support people who cannot work because of lockdowns. For a fraction of the cost, we could institute measures to protect the most vulnerable while allowing others to get on with their lives. In World War II, countries like the UK, Germany, and Japan sent their children to the countryside to protect them from the dangers of aerial bombing. Now, we are doing the exact opposite. We are sacrificing the well-being of our children and our young people to protect the very old, when, as I've explained, those measures don't even protect them, but place them at greater risk. And let's be honest, the children, and those just starting out in life, are the most severely affected by these lockdowns. Children can't go to school, they can't socialize with friends, and the children of the poor are the most severely affected. Online learning only works well where there's adequate adult supervision. But more importantly, schools are where a lot of kids get their best meals, and where, if there's abuse happening at home, it's discovered by other adults. In the coming years and decades, we're going to find out just what a disaster the year 2020 has been for children who grew up at this time. They would be less well educated, less socialized, and stuck with the bills to pay for economy-destroying lockdowns. Right now, fear is doing so much more harm than the virus itself. Using a combination of vaccines and focused protection, we can achieve herd immunity without sacrificing our economy and the lives of our young people. This should not be a right or left political issue. This is the most humane policy that minimizes harms and achieves the greatest well being for the greatest number of people. It's just common sense.